Cultivating a church that is more honest and open to doubt. Coming up, Diana Butler Bass on the Church of Tomorrow. But first, one message. Looking for a small group curriculum for your church that really works? Living Compass is brand new, and it offers a way to bring real transformation into your congregation. Living Compass focuses on wholeness and wellness, and you can check them out at livingcompass.org. Okay, here's your program. Hi everybody, I'm Chris. Y'all, welcome to ChurchNext, a place where people who are passionate about the local church come to hear from experienced mentors who have something to say about building healthy congregations. Where's Christianity going? What's keeping it vital? How does this affect our congregations? With me is an incredibly talented woman who's done a lot of thinking about these things and others, Dr. Diana Butler Bass, an author, speaker, historian whose latest book, Christianity After Religion, sheds a lot of light on these questions. And Diana, let's start right there. Welcome to ChurchNext. And why don't you begin by telling us, what do you mean by Christianity after religion?
Hi, Chris. It's good to be here today. Christianity after religion is sort of a title that was argued about quite a bit at my publishing house. What I wanted to do was to write a book about religious trends in the first part of the 21st century and to present those trends in ways that would be meaningful and tell a story to folks who were just sort of interested in faith in the United States, in congregations and in other settings. And so the first title of the book was actually different. The trends that I explore point to the fact that conventional religion is on the way out in the United States, and we now see it very clearly across sort of the sociological spectrum of surveys and data and academic studies. And so the first title of the book was Beyond Religion. And I'm so glad that I did not title my book that, because the Dalai Lama published a book last winter, I think it was February earlier this year, with that title, and I went, oh no, that would have been awful.
Yeah, he would have had to change it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I would have gotten, I called Tibet right away. And so anyhow, that was the first title. And so then we played with the idea of after religion. And finally, and this is really important, I think, for people who pick up my book. My editor at Harper is a really wonderful person. He actually has a master's degree in theology from Princeton Seminary. He really knows what he's doing. And he said, you know, Diana, your book isn't just about beyond religion or after religion. You're not just interested in these trends. He said, you're really interested in what Christianity is going to look like as we move into this period beyond conventional faith. And so when he said that, we both knew what the title was. It was going to look at what is going to be the shape of Christianity as we move into the 21st century, that I do believe is going to be very different than what we knew in the 20th century.
And let's start to unpack that. You used the phrase conventional religion. How are you defining that? And let's move from there.
The way that I define conventional religion is the pattern or the shape of religious community, religious belief that we inherited through the 20th century. The 20th century was a relatively, despite it being an incredible historical period with so much social change, the shape of Christianity, the way it was practiced in community, maintained a kind of a similar ethos through much of that time period, through much of those 100 years. So you would look at a church in 1890, for example, and then you might move up to 1990, and there would be differences. You know, you'd have a hymn book perhaps that was using more contemporary language, or a liturgy that was perhaps more contemporary. But so many people actually worship in buildings that look exactly the same as they did 100 years ago. And when we're sort of being shaped by an architecture that's lasted a long time like that, it says something to who we are. Conceptions of God did not vary a whole lot over the course of the century. And certainly the pattern of community that we expected, that there was a paid minister, that there's a denomination with a headquarters, that there's a hymn book, you know, all of these different kinds of things remain pretty much the same. And so that's what I mean by conventional religion. So the conventional pattern of 20th century faith, that has been the way that Americans, North Americans really, because it includes our Canadian friends too, Canadian and American Christians shaped their lives over a several generations.
So then let's talk a little bit about the trends you're seeing then that are turning that upside down even.
Well, certainly there are huge trends across the board that are challenging those old patterns, and some of those trends include things like belief in God. The number of Americans who say that they believe in God has gone down slowly over the last 5 decades, but now is at one of the lowest recorded numbers we've ever been able to sort of pick up since we've done surveys. You know, you didn't have these kinds of surveys in the 18th century, nor did we before the Civil War. But beginning in the late 19th century, we began to have mechanisms to actually do these kinds of social, count society and beliefs and things like that.
So does it go down from like 98% to 88%? I mean...
Well, actually, yeah. It goes down from 99% to 90% over the course of the last 50 years. And that doesn't seem like a whole lot, but if you start factoring it out by generational cohort, then it becomes really kind of an eye-opener, because older Americans believe in God in much higher numbers. The reason that number is 90% right now is because people who are 70 years old and older have very high levels of belief in God. But people who are 40 and younger, less than half of them say they believe in God. So we have a huge generational divide. And sometimes when I'm talking, you know, some particularly baby boomers do this, and that's, I can talk about baby boomers since I was born at the end of the baby boom, and they're my people. Baby boomers will sometimes say, "Oh, well, you know, that's just because they're young. You know, when they'll
come around,
and you know, they get married, they're going to believe in God. And we know this because when we were young, we were the baby boom. We were skeptical. We didn't believe in God. We experimented. Blah blah blah." Truth of it is that baby boomers today, yes, indeed, they were skeptical and all that kind of stuff. Now they're at between basically 45 and 65, a few of them a little bit older. But that generation of people, when survey takers asked them when they were in their 30s if they believed in God, 80-some% of them still said they did. And now their children and their grandchildren are answering that question only around 40 to 44%. So it's a big shift.
And I think it begs the question also, Diana, that is it just God, or is there just no spiritual awareness? I mean, do the numbers change if we soft pedal what we mean by God and start trying to appeal to a spiritual side to people?
Well, you know what, Chris? The really worrisome thing is that 90% number is the soft pedaled number.
Okay.
The way that survey takers ask the question now compared to the way they ask it in the 1950s, they will say now, do you believe in God, a universal spirit, or a higher power? And in the 1950s, nobody asked that question that way. They just said, do you believe in God? And so the 90% number, the only way you can get to that number is by widening it.
Wow. Okay.
And including a very, very big sort of definition of God. If you factor that down, if you sort of limit your definition, I've seen numbers on other polls with more limited definitions that are as low as 68% of the population. So that's a great question, and people don't tend to think about that. So I'm really glad you asked it.
Well, and I also think that just anecdotally, I do run into a lot of people for whom God doesn't seem to matter, and also the idea that in answering surveys today, people seem to be more skeptical about poll takers when perhaps in the 50s or so that there was more credence, and you may be scared to say no to a question like that. Whereas, I mean, I can see that in daily life when these high numbers come out that, gosh, in my wide circle of friends, it doesn't seem like there is that much of a religious pulse or impulse that one witnesses, and I guess which gets close to what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that these kinds of things show up a lot in our lives. One is something you just said that I think is a really big cultural shift. When I was a little girl growing up in the 1960s and early 1970s, I mostly spent elementary school on the East Coast, and my folks moved out to Arizona when I was in junior high school. So I sort of lived on both sides of the country. But when I was a little kid, if people were to talk about God, it was really coterminous with talking about being an American.
Yeah.
Is that the only people who even existed in our imagination who didn't believe in God were communists. Yeah. And so I do not know anyone who would admit that they didn't believe in God. I had a very skeptical grandfather. He was kind of a free thinker. I have very interesting kind of religious heritage in my family. But, he would never have told anybody he didn't believe in God. He would say, yeah, there's a God, I just hate the church. And so he was the original I'm spiritual but not religious guy.
Right.
Although I think that he was really kind of a closet atheist, and now he'd be much more comfortable saying that.
Right.
But that was what it was like then. But now people feel very free to just say, no, I don't really buy it. I don't believe in God.
Yeah, and just a tangent, and we in the church, I work as a pastor, as you know, lament all those people who aren't here any longer, when probably a great number of them had feelings like your grandfather, and it's probably more liberating for them not to be.
Yes, I think that's really true. So, that's a change, which means that people now will say to survey takers, I just don't buy it. I just don't believe in God. And so there's a level of honesty in people when they're answering surveys that I think is really quite important, that is actually showing up in the polls. And I also think that there is a level of, this is what most people don't realize, there's a level of sophistication in the polling that was absent 50, 60, certainly 70 years ago. We did not have the level of mathematical precision and the sophistication in asking questions.
Yeah. And, before we get off this particular trend, because I think there's so many implications in those of us who are shepherding and leading local congregations, because our evangelism efforts, that many of them are very dated, then all come into question here. If we're looking upon a population that you're describing for us, and we're trying to use these kind of appeals to interest folk, it really changes how we address this, doesn't it?
Yes, it really truly does. You know what? We're working out here. I'm sitting in my office in the backyard, and my neighbor is just turning their leaf blower. Might I just step out of the frame for 1 second and close a window?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
This is the down-to-earth Diana's really in her house thing. So
right. Oh, I'm reminded, who was it that had to let, Cameron Trimble, I think, had to let her dogs out. Kenda Creasy Dean had to get the water guy at the door. So believe me, you have great precedent in having to tend to household matters.
Well, the leaf blower is now behind a closed window, and I can hear you a lot better.
There you go. But anyway, the implications then on how we shape congregations.
Well, I think that the biggest implication of all, and I actually want this to be heard and chewed on, I guess, as we would say in the Episcopal Church, read, marked, and inwardly digested, by every single person in a church, is we need to be honest. We need to create communities of honest engagement with doubt, with levels of certainty. And if we're going to have a church, you cannot literally expect in the 21st century that everybody is going to walk in the door that they're going to all 100% say they believe in God, and they're going to be certain that that God exists without a doubt. Any religious community today is going to have some level of real questioning going on among people. And if you give the implication that you are not if you're a community that does not allow for that kind of questioning, that doesn't give room for those sorts of levels of certainty, well, then you're creating a dishonest community, because those levels are there. Every single poll shows that people are more honest to poll takers, and I just sort of wonder, are they being honest to their ministers as well as the poll takers? You know, people are still kind of, I suspect, a lot of people are still sort of lying to their priests, but they're being honest to Gallup, and that's just wrong. You know, we need to create communities that are based on honest engagement. And so that's the first implication of it for me. And then the second is, you know, how do we we're really going to have some serious questions over the next couple decades about the language of theism, about how we talk about God, how we create sacred space where we not just give people concepts about God, but actually create communities where people can connect with realities that make God a relational reality rather than just a thing, an idea that people have.
And I'm going to give you some pushback here, Diana, because you and I, I'm sure, have read stories and heard opinions of people who say, well, the problem with Christian churches is they don't stand for anything, and they need to articulate who God is and what God's about. And once you get into this recovery of orthodoxy, that's the whole problem with Christianity and with church attendance and relevancy and that kind of thing. You hear that rhetoric a lot.
Yes, you do. I have people argue that with me all the time. And if anybody sees this, they're going to be really, who has seen me in other places, they're going to be surprised what I say here. There's a level of that is correct. I actually do believe that theology is important, and that belief is important, and that clarity is important. But those things are only right in the correct order. And what I mean by that is, I do not think that that putting that kind of dogmatic creed out front as a test for whether or not one should be welcome in a congregation, or what a congregation is ultimately about, putting that as the number one thing. You know, we are a community that believes X, and you must believe it too, or come here and we'll help you be certain that these things are true. That I do not think is a solution to the problems that are facing Christianity or Christian communities in the 21st century. Because that winds up being exclusionary, inhospitable, and does not create this honest environment that I was just talking about.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but also that begs the whole definition of faith, because to think that you have it figured out, that you know who you are and where you're going, is actually just a fallacy. I mean, we have to exercise this thing called faith, don't we?
Well, I've been talking about this some on the road. I was just preaching last weekend a sermon on this very thing. The passage was in Mark chapter 8, when it's the great end of the chapter about discipleship. And I pointed out in my sermon that it's intriguing to me that you get at the end of Mark 8, you know, get Peter's confession, which is a belief statement. Who are you? You are the Messiah. And then you get, it says in the next little portion of the text, then Jesus began to teach them about his suffering, that he would die, and he would be raised on the third day. So you get a confession, you get this teaching piece, and then finally it says, and if you're going to be a true disciple, if you're going to follow me, you have to take up your cross and follow me. So you get this very kind of scary formulation of discipleship. And so there it is in Mark. That's it. It's there. Belief, teaching, strong demand. But it comes halfway through the darn gospel. It's not the beginning. You know, and so I said to the people in the sermon, when I was preaching, I said, this is after 7.5 chapters. Jesus and his learners, this community of disciples, they've been together about 2.5 years as this piece occurs narratively in the Gospel of Mark. So what comes first? And you look back and you get this, you know, Jesus walking by a lake, and he sees Peter and he sees Andrew, and he says, follow me, I will make you fishers of men. Jesus does not walk by those guys and say, hey, you two, do you believe that I'm the Son of God? Give me a confession. Tell me what you believe about faith, and then I'll let you follow me. The Gospel of Mark starts in this completely relational place. And then it moves through 7 chapters. It arcs through 7 chapters of practices of faith. And that's what they do for about 2 years or so, is that they learn how to heal people. They pray together. They clearly sing together. They celebrate together. They mourn together. I can't imagine what a bad day it was when they got the news that John the Baptist had been killed. And it actually talks about Jesus and the disciples mourning together. And they heal together. They go on a mission together. They feed 5,000 people, and then they feed 4,000 the next couple days later. And so what you get is you get this incredible, in the Gospel of Mark, you get this incredible model of what it means to be the faith community. It starts in relationship, follow me, simple, an invitation into a life of being friends. It moves through an arc of practice where the people learn together to do all these amazing things to heal the world. And after they do that for a long time, then comes the big belief statement. And that belief statement gives a sense of courage and hope, so that when you go through the end of the Gospel of Mark, you get the confession, and then the gospel starts sliding out to the passion. So when you go through that darkness, you actually have the relationship, the practice, and then the belief that gives you the courage to face the suffering. So I think that is the model of community for the 21st century. That's the biblical model of community. Belief is important, but belief is only important in the right order.
Well, and even more to your point, you know, in that passage is also shortly thereafter Peter's denial.
Yeah,
so that his statement of belief then even becomes something that it has to be refined.
Yeah, I've actually been talking to my publisher about writing my next book on belief. And a tentative sort of title, or part of the title, will be Practicing Belief, because we do think about belief as a sort of a set of propositions to which we must adhere in our brains. And that's when you ask me the question about people who want to make churches stronger, that's typically what they're talking about. If we just have a set of propositions that make it perfectly clear about what we believe, what the church believes, and that we can all kind of sign our name on this set of propositions, then we're going to fix everything. But what if belief isn't that? What if belief is something else? And I think that, as you suggest right there, you know, Peter does come up with a confession, he does come up with a belief, but then he turns his back on it. And so I think that belief is actually something we have to practice, that it has actual dimensions of learning, of conviction, of courage, and all these kinds of aspects that we understand much more in terms of the dispositions or the actions of our souls, rather than just the propositions to which we happen to adhere. So these are things that I think are very important, and theology is moving in this kind of direction, and I think that the more theology moves in these directions, the more local communities are going to begin to understand that it isn't just coming out the door saying, you know, here's our creed and we're going to fix everything with our creed, but rather creed is, as I love to talk about, is credo. It's this matter of our heart. It's not simply a flag we fly outside of a church. And so, in terms of it being a the Apostles' Creed or a mission statement. People act sometimes like their mission statements are creeds, or a long book of doctrine or whatever it is. So,
well, I do want to pull this back practically, because Diana, you have a vantage point that a lot of us don't, which is that you get to a lot of different congregations, not only to speak and to teach, but also to study. And I'm wondering if you can give us some examples or some of the things that you've come across in your travels that you think are good ways forward for congregations who are starting to move towards these big implications, of needing to be communities that engage with doubt and uncertainty. How does that look?
Oh, I'm trying to think about what I have seen in congregations. I got your questions in advance, and I was looking at those. Right now, I'm actually seeing a lot more congregations that I would say are fumbling around. And, that might sound discouraging, but I actually think that that's probably a good thing. Our level of confidence in our congregations is eroding, and I even hear rather strong congregations I studied even 15 years ago or so, say, we used to think we knew how to do this, but now we're finding that even the solutions we had 10 years ago aren't really fitting what's going on now. And so we're asking ourselves new questions. So when I hear that, it actually makes me understand that there is no program that is going to fix all this. We have some interesting resources, that are available to all of us to help congregations to ask questions. There are theological resources, I think, for example, about Living the Questions, that, really kind of cool video series that gives people a chance to talk about Jesus and church and theology in all kinds of different ways. So that's a resource. And so those kinds of things are out there. But I think that the best resource we have is our own sense of wondering what the future will look like. And when we wonder, when we realize that what we have doesn't work, it should open our hearts towards discernment. What is it that God is calling us to do now? How can the gospel be embodied in our community and in our families as they currently exist? And so I think that for any vital congregation, the primary call of the 20th century is this continual life of discernment as a community. Where is the Holy Spirit? Where is God leading us? What kinds of programs did we do that once worked but now aren't working? Is God still evident in the activities and the processes and the structures we've done? And so to me, that's one of the places that I think that vitality is continually fostered in communal processes of discernment. It's kind of exhausting because it means you never get to rest. You come up with an idea, you implement it, you have a great 4 or 5 years with it, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not quite working. And so then you got to go back to the drawing board. And sometimes people ask me, what do they think? What do I think the 21st century is like in terms of these sorts of structures? Will we invent structures that our grandchildren will have to get rid of? And we probably will, because that's just human nature. But what I also think is happening is part of the postmodern condition is creating structures that are flexible enough and have enough change built in that they can constantly be made anew, sort of like the iPhone. I was just reading this fantastic article in a business magazine about how innovation has happened around technology. Yeah. And one of the things that they say is that if you put an entirely new product on a shelf, most people will pass it by because a new product is way too challenging. But if you take a product that people already love, and certainly, the iPhone has become one of those things, and you simply continually upgrade it or change it to, iPhone 1.0, iPhone 2.0, iPhone, now we have the 5th version of iPhone, people will go crazy and continue to want to pursue it because they want familiarity, they want the structure, they want the product they know, but they want it to do new things that can help them connect better, take better pictures, read more online, watch their TV shows, etc. And so I read this article and I thought, man, that is like the gospel for church in the 21st century. You want to take a familiar product, something that people know and trust and love, and you want to continually be taking it through these various kinds of stages and say, you know, is this product, as people love it, still doing, still communicating, still connecting in a way that people find exciting and meaningful? And so that's one of the things I think that we're learning. I mean, this is part of the 21st century. This is part of living in this kind of technological postmodern culture. We're learning how to do that. And church needs to learn how to do that.
Let me ask you to put your to get your crystal ball out, because I'm wondering what the shape of congregational life might look like in 10, 20, 30, 50 years.
Oh dear. History is littered with historians' dead bodies who thought they could answer questions like that. Oh, you know,
And you can be as specific as you like.
Yeah, you know, I think that a lot of, I'm sort of two turns of mind of it. One is I think that unlike people who tried to answer this question in the 1960s, I do think that a lot of the beauty of tradition is still going to be with us. In the 20th century, a lot of people looking ahead thought that, you know, folks would hate stained glass windows and that old hymns would be worthless and that, you know, we had to tear down the old Victorian buildings and put up new modern buildings, and that was the future. I don't think that that's the case. I think that contemporary cultures over the last couple, you know, even the last couple hundred years, have showed a remarkable resilience and interest in history. And so even the moments that are sort of the most contemporary, the most modern, or the most technological, there's always this little piece of the human soul that wants to somehow connect with the mystery of the past and the loveliness of old architecture and the power of ancient words and the wisdom of, you know, sort of ancient beauty. So all of that stuff, I think that's all going to be around. I think that is really wonderful. And I think that one of the places you find things like that are congregations and ancient, you know, things that have ancient roots. Friends of mine, I know people at the monastery in Holy up in Boston, the Society of St. John the Evangelist, and good friends with Brother Kevin up there. And he noted, the brothers noticed one time that there were all these young students from Harvard and MIT that were coming to the monastery. And they couldn't figure out why these students were coming. And finally, they had a group of them over for lunch and asked them, well, what's so intriguing to you about the monastery? And one of the Harvard students said, oh, well, what do you mean? Where else can I go where I see a bunch of guys dressed in robes walking through clouds of incense chanting in Latin? And the brothers just kind of laughed because they knew they were the only place in town that did that. You know, there were a lot of things you can get in Harvard Square, but, you know, the monastery is the only place where you're going to have that one. And so church is the only place where we can get a lot of this stuff. So I think that's in place, and that is beautiful. But the other piece is that we're going to also be, I think, open community. I think we're going to be a lot more kind of like what we might want to consider a wiki church or non-geographical church. I think there's going to be, with the beauty of history and with the beauty of connection, with the beauty of tradition, we're going to be a lot more. We're going to be multi-portal. There's going to be a lot more ways of connecting with religious community. I think we're going to be a lot more open to the wisdom of other kinds of traditions, even non-Christian ones, while retaining our core of what it means to be Christian. I think we're going to be just a lot more able with technology and understand the power of, here I am we're sitting at our computers, doing this. I think we're going to really understand these tools a lot better, and we're also going to understand that they're not just tools, but that these are actually my computer. Because I'm a baby boomer again, I have tended to think of it as a really fancy typewriter. But my daughter, who's 14, to her, this is just a way of life. And so I'm now understanding more and more that this thing that in front of me that I used to think of as a machine is actually an extension of human experience and human intelligence. And somehow those insights about our relationship to technology are going to make it into how we construct Christian community over the next several decades. And that is frightening for some people. They get images of the Borg collective, not as in Marcus Borg, but as in Star Trek. And so they get interested. They get images of that, and it frightens them. But that's where the future is. A historian, Robert Vogel, who won a Nobel Prize in economics about, I think it was 15 or 20 years ago, he writes about how we are creating a culture of biotechnology where there's this complete interface between human life and human experience and technological stuff, and that this is the frontier of human change. And so, if that's the case, the church is going to go there, because the church is incarnational. Wherever people go, the church goes. So it's going to be both the beauty of the past, and it's going to be this provocative, challenging, amazing remaking of community on the basis of technology and globalization. And we're just at the very, very beginning of that.
Yeah, and the church is often known, Diana, for its ability to adapt quickly.
That's right.
We will be there 50 years after everybody else.
Well, it's interesting. Chris, people actually say that, we think we're slow, but if you look historically, sometimes the church was the very first group to adopt the new technologies.
Well, you look at the number of religious websites on the web. Next to, I think, pornography, they're the most.
I wouldn't be surprised by that. And, I just look back to the historical example because it's kind of what I do naturally. At the time of the Protestant Reformation, it was the people who were on the cutting edge of spiritual change that were the people who understood and harnessed the power of the printed word. Mm-hmm. And I can imagine some hypothetical kind of vestry meeting, in 1518, where people are sitting around saying, all the young people are reading books. What are we going to do about this? We got to stop the spread of the book, and good luck with that.
Exactly. Well, and then what will happen is, of course, those kids become vestry members, and you have it done. But what I think you're hinting at, and I'm playing it towards your earlier comments, is that there seems to be a religious impulse that even though we may get the number of people who don't believe rising, that perhaps that's a mediating, that's for various reasons coming to whatever the true level is. But are we talking about a religious impulse that's even evolutionary, or just part of the human condition?
Oh, some people will say that it is an evolutionary switch in human history. Now, I don't know whether I go with that. It's an interesting idea. I've certainly sat on panels of people making that case, and I always listen to it very carefully. So I am sort of listening and suspending my own judgment on that suggestion. But what I do know for certain is that these are times of huge change. And I think what is definitely happening, and it's been the thread of this conversation, is that that conventional way we think of religion is entirely going away. There is very little of it left right now. Most of it seems to be stuck inside of some mainline churches, for what it's worth. But that is becoming such a small minority report in Western culture that it's really surprising to those of us who study religion as a phenomenon. But what is growing at the same time is that just because that one pattern of religion is going away, there is also this sort of huge thing that people refer to as spirituality. And I think that they refer to it as spirituality because there's just not really a better word for it. And they're trying to make a distinction between what was and what they sense is arriving. And so a lot of people are very excited about this, about whatever it is that is arriving. And the shape of this thing out here seems to be much more experiential. It seems to be much more based in practices. People are really into spiritual practices. Even your most diehard beach walker who experiences God by looking at sunsets likes yoga. And that's like a spiritual practice. And people want to think about, what do I do over time that helps me have a life of meaning? People are searching for meaning and purpose and all these things. And I also think that people actually are leaning towards belief, just belief, not belief constructed as creed and dogma, as it was in conventional church, but belief constructed as conviction and meaningful experience. And so, I'm working lately with folks about talking about what their convictions are, and it's remarkable to me how strong people's convictions are about feeding hungry people, about the fact that they want the planet to be healthy, to pass on to their grandchildren, that they think that violence and religion together are a bad thing. These are all beliefs. These are convictions. But they're things that we hold in our whole being rather than just stuff we happen to believe about God. So all of this over here, these very experiential sorts of dimensions of this thing that we call religious phenomenon, what we used to call religion, people now call spirituality. And so I think it's really important to understand that shift in language and to not simply poo-poo people when they say that they're interested in spirituality.
Because what I'm trying to do is provide something for folks who are viewing this to take away some practical understandings for how they can shape their congregation.
Right. Well, I think that the practical piece of the work that I've done over the last couple years, I've always got that sort of in different books, and I've been trying to attack it in different ways. In Christianity, for the rest of us, I talk very specifically about 10 practices that my research team observed that made for good congregations, and that's a really great guide. And what I love that book because what it isn't, it's not a book that says do these 10 things and your congregation will thrive. Instead, it's simply an invitation into considering what practices God might be calling your congregation to by looking at what practices these other vibrant mainline congregations have engaged in. And when people say, well, what practices to do, I have had the same answer for a decade, and I will probably have the same answer till I die. And the two that are most important are theological reflection, creating a community that engages the stories and texts of Christian faith and does it in a way that makes a difference to our lives. And then the other one is hospitality. And hospitality is the welcome of the stranger. And that doesn't mean just to have them come to your coffee hour. It means to throw open all of everything in a church that would exclude people from the life of community. And this is very challenging. It's raised questions about communion and open communion in the Episcopal Church. And rightly so, we have not begun to solve that. That little bit that the bishops did at this last General Convention, that was the first asking of that question. I suspect that in 100 years there will be no requirement of baptism for the Lord's Supper. We'll have completely open communion, but it'll take us a little while to get there because that theological argument needs to be constructed. But theological reflection, hospitality, do those things, and those things will change you. So I have that practical stuff, and in the new book, I actually present a model for engaging the shape of Christian community, that shape that I was describing from the book of Mark, beginning with belonging, working through practices and behavior, and working toward what it means to believe. And so I offer that as a map or a guide, sort of a directional pointer of congregations that are trying to rethink what it means to be a vibrant spiritual community for the future.
I recovered my question, Diana, which if you're suggesting this greater openness to mystery and that kind of thing, how do those of us who are shepherding, piloting congregations that can be really difficult to change, to open up to, I mean, who come to church wanting things never to change, and who bring their support and who bring their enthusiasm, how do we go about the task of leadership, which, as you're suggesting, calls us to greater openness to mystery, to greater ideas of faith in terms of it's not written down in marble, but how do we go about as leaders gently moving towards a more open open community?
Well, one of the things I think that really, truly should happen over the next decade or so is that churches, especially mainline, the old mainline churches, and sort of what I would call the social justice Catholic churches and liberal synagogues, things like this, we need an entirely new PR campaign. Is that right now in the sort of the general population's mind, the idea that exists is that if you want to be protected from change, go to a church. And that, I can't even find that anywhere in the Bible. It's like anyone who walks in the door of a church should be expecting that they will be changed by what happens in that community. So somehow we've got to change this. We have to shift the perception of churches as a place where we're protected from change, but that churches are communities that are on the cutting edge
of transformation,
of all of the best sorts. We're not going to ask people to change just because it's the latest and greatest and it's relevant and it's hip, but we're asking people to change, to be transformed into having lives of meaning, into being better citizens, into creating a common good, into being challenged to their core by a living God. Those are the things that have to happen. We got to communicate that message outside the church. Don't come here if you want to be safe. This is not the place to be safe. This is the place where you're going to encounter something meaningful and life transforming.
Well, yeah, I mean, we too much of Christianity says, well, you have one pinnacle moment in your Christian life in which you go from dark to light, and the rest is just frosting. When what you're suggesting is that life as we know it is one of continual change and continual transformation, and if the church can't be really vocal about that as its foundation stone, that we won't be able to make it through a transition.
That's correct. I think that one of the things that we've privileged comfort in the church over this life of transformation. And so what we need to do is we need to shift that back. We need to go back towards that constant reminding people we are a transformative, a change-oriented community that gives you comfort along the way. And so instead of saying, oh, we're going to be a comforting community that occasionally will change you, we need to reverse that order. And so it's not that it's not sometimes peaceful or beautiful or restful or any of those things. That's part of the process of transformation, is that the Jewish and Christian vision of transformation is that there are actually times of rest and times of great peacefulness and times of knowing that you have this God who's walking with you through the change. But it's always about this pushing, this edgy, constant engagement with a God who's calling us into a better future. So I think that that's one place where we've made some serious mistakes in in communicating who we are. But now you're talking about, well, that's great. Everybody who might come to my church could have that attitude if we got it right. But what am I going to do with the people who are there?
Well, I mean, you kind of suggest through, as my mind moves as you're talking, I mean, you can do that, you can affect that in preaching, you can affect that in curriculum. I mean, there are ways to shape that and to bring us gently along. And ultimately, I do think that even in your sleepiest church that I've ever been to, the reason people, a strong reason continues to be that people want to come to change. People want to come to see hope. People want to come. Why make time for it?
No, that's exactly right. And people want to change in all kinds of ways. If they're sick, they want to feel like they're being healed. If they're scared, they want to be say it's not going to be so bad. If they're afraid, they want courage. And so I think one of the things we have to point out to people is that all change is not bad change.
Right.
It's indeed a lot of change that the gospel calls us to is positive, amazing change that makes our lives better. And the world better. And so
if your ship is sinking, that new ship looks really nice.
Well, that's true. And I the biggest change ever in the whole sort of history of salvation, that we have presented to us in the scriptures, is that the disciples, when they were following Jesus, expected one outcome from their relationship with him, is that they were going to take over Jerusalem and kick out the Romans, or whatever it was, and he died. And it's like, well, wait a second, this was not the story we expected. And so the transformational moment happened with the resurrection, and that the resurrection does so much for us spiritually and historically and psychologically and theologically. But one of the things it does is it holds up this vision for us that all endings are only new beginnings. And that is the framework of the entirety of the Christian life, that all endings are only new beginnings. So, to write a book about Christianity after religion, if people get scared by the title, they should be cheering it, because that means something's dying, and that means that something else is being born, that there is that the unexpected future is just around the corner, and whatever that thing is, that is going to change us in ways that give us hope, give us courage, make us love our neighbor better, all of that kind of stuff. And so, to me, that's what it means to live the resurrection, is to live in that constant ability to let go of my expectations, to let go of what I thought was good for me, and instead to let come the truest of the work that God is doing in the world around me. And so I think that for congregations as they exist, one of the things that we need to develop practices of letting go, and we need to develop practices of letting come. And I think that is going to be part of the sort of the pastoral theology work of the future. What are those practices of letting go of the things that need to die? And what are the practices of letting a new future come? And there are practices in the Christian tradition of both of those things. And sometimes I think we are better at employing practices of status quo than we are to really think about these two movements of endings and beginnings, of letting go and letting come. And I think that we need to be in that place, right now. And that's a pretty exciting thing, I think, for people in leadership. It's a pretty exciting thing for me. I mean, people think of me as a leader, but heck no, nobody's ever ordained me. I just happen to have a PhD in church history, and I like to write books, and I like to talk. And so, I'm a lay person. And, I don't want my life to be cluttered up by all the things that, hold me back from becoming the person and having the future that I'm going to have. I constantly have to practice things of letting go. Just went through that with my mom dying. Oh my gosh, what we had to let go of. And it was so hard for me and my sister, especially as we're cleaning out all of my mom's stuff, of letting go of all these old things. And finally, when we got through it, my sister, She said to me just recently, she said, I didn't realize how much my life was weighted down until we let go of all of those things. And she said, I'm actually making a new life because all that stuff is gone. And what a beautiful testimony that is. That's what I think all of us want. We want to figure out what to let go of so that the new thing can come. So I think that that's an important part of Christian community. It's the thing that makes my heart charge. I got to get rid of some of these books back here.
Diana Butler Bass, what a wonderful point to end on. Thanks for being my guest here on Church Next.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. It's a long way to go to have a great conversation about some wonderful things. I hope people won't be afraid, but this is a time of hope. You just need to learn how to see it, embrace it, and live it, and that becomes the place where hope is translated into courage and action.
Amen.